Hi, I'm Stuart Elliott, the editor-in-chief of The Real Deal, and you've just tuned into the latest edition of TRD Talks Live, which we launched last week as we find ourselves all working from home now. Today, I'm here to talk about resiliency and recovery in the age of coronavirus with Marianne Tai and Scott Reckler. And you can join us every day of the week at 5 p.m. You can think of this as your CNN for real estate right now. Tomorrow's talk is going to be with the leading brokers in the LA residential market. Thursday is with developer Michael Chavot, who's at least up until now been spending billions of dollars in acquisitions recently. Obviously, probably a lot changed. And Friday is with the top investment sales brokers in New York City. You can click on the top of our homepage to find out more about what we have up and coming. And first, I want to thank our sponsor today, Justin Ehrlich and Saurabh Maheshwari of Churchill Real Estate. They are basically enabling us to made it possible for all our viewers to watch today and not just subscribers through their support. So thank you guys. So getting into our topic today, this is obviously a crisis unlike any other. It's a medical crisis. At the same time, it's an economic one. And we find ourselves a few weeks into this trying to prevent contagion in the financial world, as well as, the viral contagion that's so harrowing to deal with. Though today was a good day for the market, which was a positive sign. But, this isn't the first crisis New York has faced. And in the last 2 decades, we've had 9/11 and the Great Recession, which also felt cataclysmic at the time. So the questions, how is the real estate industry coping? What are the biggest concerns? And how does New York come out of this? So luckily, I have 2 leading figures of New York real estate today to help us out to figure out some of the way forward. So Marianne Tai, I want to welcome you. Marianne is regarded as the most powerful woman in New York real estate, according to many. She's the head of CBRE, the biggest commercial brokerage in the city. She heads up the tri-state region with 2,500 employees under her watch, and her assignments have included heading up office leasing for the World Trade Center buildings. So being involved with Ground Zero, she knows a thing or two about rebuilding. And then we have Scott. He's the chairman of RXR, one of the most active developers in the city. He's got north of $10 billion in projects, both in the city and the suburbs. And he's the former vice chairman of the Port Authority, among many other governmental appointments. And he has Governor Cuomo over to his house regularly to watch football up gold. So that puts him, in all the work he's doing right now in connection with what's happening at the highest levels. And he's on the front line of the city's response. So I want to thank both of you guys for being here today.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah, Scott, most critically, we're just talking about this before we went live, but you're working with the government on opening more hospital beds and developing the city's response. Right now, there are 53,000 beds available. We might need as many as 140,000. How and where are you scouting for space? What are you doing?
So just to take a step back, I think for me, it's not just me. It's really with the so much of the city's real estate industry and corporate and groups and civic groups have come together, and I think that's one of the maybe few shining slivers of hope here out of this situation. Is it really is one of these moments in time where you see a sense of civic responsibility, probably not seen in my lifetime, probably back to sort of World War II, where we've all realized that we have a responsibility in terms of how we behave and social distancing and staying home to protect others, to where we're all trying to figure out how do we find the resources that are going to be necessary to get through this current health crisis and this pandemic that we have that's been unprecedented. And into the case of hospitals, when you look at the numbers in terms of depending on, again, the surge of need for hospital beds, it's pretty extraordinary. I mean, the governor was originally talking about needing something like 100,000 available beds when we have 50,000 total beds in the state. And now he earlier today announced 140,000 is the target, right? And so it's a combination of creating new beds through places like Javits, and there's a bunch of other spots in the city that make sense, that whether they're hotels or large places that have have big open spaces can be converted into hospitals, as well as his order of investing all the hospitals on ways to increase the amount of availability of beds within their hospitals by 50%, which means moving other patients out of the hospitals. And then, of course, even within that, it's a level of ICUs. And if you've been, in the city, or if you've watched the news, it's amazing and scary when you see the amount of lines of people trying to get into the emergency rooms just to be tested. We had one of our neighbors was brought to one of the local hospitals yesterday, who was infected and did 10 days at home and then had to go by ambulance to the hospital. And there was just, crowds of people, no water, no communication. And after 5.5 hours, one of our family members, who was also came and picked her up and brought her to her home. And so it's, when you hear the personal implications of it, it's really a scary thought, which is why I think it's so critical for us to distance ourselves and have that sense of social distancing, staying home, staying out of public. And it's hard. It's hard for people like myself, like Mary Ann, and so many others that in other past crises, what we've done is we like to go right to the epicenter, whether it was 9/11 or Superstorm Sandy, and be there engaged and try to help. But that, we're fighting this war with this invisible enemy, and the best weapon is to actually stay away from everyone. And right. So it's hard to get your head around that.
And how many, it is hard to do that. And I think part of it is obviously just finding this space so we can spread out more and treat all the patients. For either of you, do you have a sense of how much square footage, how many buildings are needed, and how does that process work? Is the government approaching landlords? Is it, and they're getting, insurance claims if they give over their space, or how does the logistics of all this work with requisitioning all this additional space?
I mean, the outreach began certainly early last week, and the outreach came from both the city and the state, basically saying there's a variety of different kinds of product that we need. Can you get people to volunteer? I don't think anybody talk about the insurance or any of that. I think people stepped up. The real estate board became the organizing principle for the city, and that's where people registered all their properties. And whether it's economic development in the city or whether it's the state's equivalent, they've been filing through and figuring out what works for them.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. I think I'm sorry, go ahead, Joe.
No, I'm sure you've been approached as well, Scott.
I was going to just say that I think getting the Army Corps of Engineers was a game changer, and that went from I think, a more broad sort of outreach, trying to find a spot to more fun, because they have, specific hospital standards of what they're trying to build and sort of prefabbed ways to do it. And so that I think helped narrow it down. And from what I've seen is that they have identified areas that can have the most capacity spread throughout the region. So it's not just concentrated in the city. But then have levels of other locations that, to the extent that we're not able to flatten the curve and avoid the peak being too challenging, that then they would roll on to the additional locations.
Mm-hmm. And is it more Javits type spaces or hotels as well, or are there any particular locations you guys are hearing about?
Yeah, I mean, I don't. Go ahead.
No, go ahead, please.
I don't want to speak specifically of the locations, of specific locations, but they're looking at everything, right? They're looking at large areas. They're looking at hotels. Really to accommodate it, they need to have spaces that either are configured. So even hotels, it's the ballrooms are as important as the bedrooms, right? And so these are the things to think about. When you think about Javits, it's good. It's isolated. It's a lot under one place, so they can share infrastructure. So that turned out to be well, and they're using SUNY system in Westbury and Long Island, but some of the challenges with that is, depending on where the cycle goes, how long are these, the university, as an example, going to be out of ability to go open classes, so there's things out there that you got to think about as well, that on the other side of this.
What does the emergency construction look like? I mean, in China, obviously, famously, they built a hospital in 10 days. What can we do here? What do we need to do here?
I don't think people are talking about building from the ground up here. I think it's about taking existing space that's already has heating and air conditioning. Mm-hmm. And to Scott's point, it's the big open fields. If Stony Brook's gym becomes, we bring in the beds and begin to put the equipment that's needed, et cetera.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Beyond the medical, obviously it's a medical pandemic, it's also a financial crisis. Marianne, what are you seeing as far as, leases and tenants approaching landlords and tenants saying we can't pay? Are there discussions happening like that?
So I think the most important thing for me to say about all this right now is that I'm going to give you what our observations and what our speculations are, but there's still not complete clarity as to what's going on. One of the things that CBRE is focused on right now is attempting to lay out what we think is the mild, moderate, and severe case for the marketplace. I'll tell you what was incredibly interesting for me, and Scott, I'd be really interested in your thoughts on this. First, I read, I don't know if you know the blog Curbed. They did a piece on the history of pandemics in New York City and back to the 17th century. First of all, who knew we were just being lucky for the last 100 years, 2 years, because New York's had such a long history of this and the recovery of it. The second thing, though, is we did what everybody does when they're looking at the business. Let's see what happened at 9/11. Let's see what happened in 2008 at the Great Recession. Let's see what happened with Sandy. And we were stunned to realize how different things are in this situation than those. The first thing I can tell you is that Sandy was like a blip on the screen in terms of looking at the historical trajectory. It didn't actually even register in any significant way. So we kind of threw out that information. The thing I forgot about 9/11 is that we were in recession at the time of 9/11. Remember the dot-com bust and all of that? Completely forgot that was the case. And then my colleague Spencer Levy, who does global research for CBRE, came along and pointed out that we need to look globally at this, and what we should do is look at what happened after SARS. And that's been, for us, I think, one of the most interesting parts of this analysis, because the way people react in a pandemic is different than a financial crisis. Now, that's not to say that this pandemic can't turn into a financial crisis if, in fact, things go to an extreme. But SARS was basically, if you look at it across all the different cities in Asia, but also in Toronto as well, that experienced it, a relatively quick turnaround. Because here's the thing, unlike in a financial crisis or 9/11, if you can find the solutions, whether it's the tests, whether it's a protocol that allows certain people to come back into the workplace, or whether it's, God willing, a vaccine, the thing turns around. So we're actually looking at all of those as we're building our analysis.
I think most people know about the Spanish flu, and maybe that's the extent of it, back in the 1910s.
No, it's extraordinary. It goes all the way back to the 1600s. And it would come every so often. And, you begin to realize that the Wall Street, the wall that was built was to keep disease out. That it existed. I mean, we've had a history. Somehow we always come back stronger. Just looking, I have to say, just looking at the employment numbers, we walked into this terrible situation with 1.7 million office-based jobs. That's the highest of all time. Now, in 2008, we lost 98,000 jobs in a period of 12 months. At 9/11, we lost about 120-something thousand. If we lost even the combination of those, we'd still be way above the highest level we've ever seen in New York City. So we're hoping.
If you look at the stock market numbers too, I think over the weekend when it was worse than today, it was 33% down off the peak. And if you look back at dot-com bust or 2008, it was in the 40s or 50%, I was really surprised by that.
Yeah, and I think just also when you're going back to what Marianne said, it's again, what's unprecedented here is we've never been in a situation where we've actually tried to shut the economy down purposely for a period of time and then try to turn it back on. And I think, the key is for this to work, we are going to need significant federal support, right? This is, going back to my point before, right? This is where you really need all elements to come together, the private sector, civic, and government. And government's got to be the safety net here. And, I know they're working on this bill. This will be a first of many. I mean, I think, this is, they're talking $2 trillion. It's probably $5 trillion and maybe $10 trillion to do this, because really they need to replace whatever economic activity is lost, whether this is a month, 2 months, 3 months, 4 months, whatever that might be. And my personal view, and I've put forward some documents on this that I've shared with the legislatures, is they really should start not only just the big companies, but with small businesses, the non-for-profits, and focus on the people that are being hired, right? If you can avoid people from losing their jobs by supplementing their salaries, the startup of this whole thing is going to be that much more quickly. And so, the concept really is fund payroll for companies, and companies can continue to fund their employees. If they're funding their employees, then those employees can go out and have money to spend, and they can stay in business, right? If you can't fund payroll, the unemployment numbers are going to spike all the way through the roof. So, there's some plans out there now with some small business loan programs that I think are something that we've been promoting. I call it the Survive and Thrive, instead of S&L, S&T loan program. Because you want them to not only fund them with loans, with money to actually get through the period of unemployment, but when you recover, they're going to need money to recover long term. So whatever loans they have, give them short-term, long-term loans with low interest rates so they can get through the cycle. And I think that will help a lot. If they don't do that, what's going to happen is companies are going to shed their employees. Companies are going to start going out of business. They're not going to be able to pay rent. They're not going to be able to pay the utilities. And eventually, the banks are going to be the ones that have the problem. It's all going to end up in the credit market, and we're going to be back to that same cycle where you're going to have the federal government having to bail out the banks, versus which is going to be that is after it cascades to the point where the banks are holding the bad loans at the end, versus if they can support it in the beginning. And so I'm pleased to see how quickly they're moving, because they are moving quickly. And as far as I'm concerned, I think overshoot. Don't worry if you're giving people the funding that maybe shouldn't deserve it. You'll get it back by charging taxes later. But now is not the time to try to make this perfect. We need to get liquidity and in the system and make sure that people don't lose jobs.
So you think the $2 trillion package that the feds have, I guess it depends if you're looking at, the Republican version or the Democratic version, but do you think either of those would make a positive impact right now? You're saying even if it's the Republican version, you can tax that stuff later. And what immediate effect do you think that would have?
I think we've all been to this before, like Marianne, myself. There's always flaws in policy, right? And there's always unintended consequences. And so you hope that this is one that is well thought out. You want to try to keep it simple. You want to get the money to the people as quickly as possible, the small businesses as quickly as possible. You want to make sure there's credit for our larger companies to be able to survive this and not collapse, particularly the ones that are hit in hospitality, travel, retail, restaurants, right? These are the ones that are really taking it. And then the municipalities, right? The governments are not going to have money. I mean, I think the New York City controller came and said that I think something like $6-7 billion of revenue lost from what their expectation is right now. The airports, right? Think about the Port Authority, right? People aren't flying their planes in, people aren't paying tolls, people aren't taking the path. Same thing with the MTA. So there's every part of the economy is going to need some infusion. And so what I'm saying is $2 billion is a good starting point, but we're going to need more than $2 billion when we get through this, or $2 trillion rather, when we get through this.
And I think Scott makes such a perfect point about the interconnectedness of things. Rather than attempting to overlay and say, big business, they got their bailout, or the big banks got their bailout. Everything actually interrelates to everything else. And there has to be a full spectrum of support for the small businesses all the way up through the major banks, and certainly through the institutions, at least in terms of our city, like the Port Authority and like the MTA, that are at basically the heartbeat of what keeps our economy going here.
Yeah. And the talking about layoffs and unemployment, I think one of the Fed chairs mentioned something like 20 or 30% unemployment as a worst case scenario. What do you think? What will layoffs look like in the real estate industry? Would you imagine? Yesterday, for example, Compass, the brokerage, laid off 15% of its staff. Are you hearing a lot more coming down the pike? I mean, obviously, hospitality. It seems like there's going to be a lot of layoffs there for sure.
I think what we're hearing really predominantly is the hospitality and the retail side of it. And I am not hearing an enormous amount. Remember that at least in my realm, it's variable income because people are on commission by and large. So there isn't a tendency to go in that direction. But I do think that we have to look really hard at both retail and the support of retail and hotel, because it is also very dependent on our tourist population. We have to be sure that we're able to accommodate people when they come back.
Marianne, what are you telling your brokers to do now? Are they checking in with building owners and tenants? Are they renegotiating things? What kind of is the role right now?
I just said to my son the other day, I said, I think we're working harder from home than we ever worked in the office, or at the very least, I feel more tired at the end of the day. And I think it's because at least in the office, you can get up, walk around, say hi, do whatever. But it has been a steady onslaught. And I think it's because because the visibility isn't there. So we're seeing everything from tenants coming to us, occupiers of space or companies in the process of transactions saying, what should we do? Should we hold? Is this a moment for us to, I have a near-term lease expiration. Am I going to be pushed out of my space? Every conceivable layer of this is there. And in turn, landlords are wanting to know what are we seeing? And are people are approaching them and saying, give us a discount in rent. Now, by the way, to date, I haven't seen anybody except on the retail side giving discounts. Scott, I don't know if you can say anything about RXR at this point, but people keep calling me up and saying, should I get a rent holiday? And I'm like, does your lease document provide for it? I don't know any documents that provide for rent holidays. And it's really not been the case to date. Again, hard to know what will be coming. I don't know what you've seen, Scott.
No, I think that's right. I think where you've seen it is retail tenants, restaurants, or really small firms that are driven maybe to some degree by hospitality, and it's not even really been. It's been more of a deferral request in the handful that we've had, and the problem is, and this is really where it goes back to what I said before. If people stop paying rent, then, how are we going to pay for the people? We haven't let go any of the people that were working in our buildings, right? We're still paying their salaries. We're still paying utilities. We're still paying real estate taxes. We're still paying mortgages. So it's, it's to the extent that people stop paying rent, you have all these different costs, and, the municipalities will be hurt if they don't get paid. And I went, before talking about the banks, what will happen. So there's a cascading effect, and it's all connected, which is why you really got to get to the source and try to put, funding into the system as quickly as possible.
Right. It seems like you can't have mortgages not being paid, because then there's a systemic breakdown that happened, because when people can't pay their rents, then landlords can't pay their bills, then that trickles to the commercial mortgage market, then that goes through the financial system. There can't just yank one piece of it out, it wouldn't seem like.
One of the interesting observations that our investment salespeople have made is because retail had been very strong for a long period of time, the taxes, as the city charged real estate taxes on the retail portions of buildings, have been unusually high. If you're actually watching that part of a building's rent stream fall away, and yet the taxes are still there, that becomes a challenging situation as well. I'll tell you one thing, everybody's going to have a very careful eye on their business interruption insurance from now on. I think leases are going to have different definitions of what force majeure is. I mean, when you think about what are the lasting things that came out of 9/11, the fact that we now all go through turnstiles or some kind of security, I think that is our life now. There are going to be things that come out of this that will not go away anytime soon.
Does force majeure fit into these leases? How are you kind of handling those?
Most of them don't cover medical event, as far as we've been able to discern.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think, there's been some talk from a policy standpoint about recharacterizing the coronavirus incident as actually being business interruption, qualifying for business interruption insurance as a way to basically achieve the funding, the losses to where they would go, and let the insurance companies be the conduit, which I think makes some sense in the sense that insurance companies have historically been dealing with a crisis, trying to identify where the losses really were, verifying it and funding it, and then having the federal government backstop it. So that's one of the things that might come out of here, and it's probably an easier way to do it than just sort of a shotgun way.
we talked a little bit about like the systemic issues. Over the weekend, there were some pretty dire warnings about instability in the commercial mortgage market. And Tom Barrack had a post. And, how much of a concern is that popping up for you now? The Fed stepped in yesterday to ease some of that concern with, unlimited buybacks. But what do you kind of foresee as the distress piece of things?
I should mention, I know RXR has a debt fund. Are they, are they looking at this and realizing that opportunity is going to come down the road with this?
Yeah, well, thanks for the softball, Marianne. I would say this, just first on the issue itself, right, which is irrespective of CMBS, if you've watched over the last 2 weeks, even watching the 10-year Treasury and other parts of the marketplace, they become dysfunctional. And that's part of the risk when you're going through something like this, right? And so I think the Fed has done a good job of coming in with force to try to get the markets functioning, creating liquidity and letting paper start trading into whatever level it is. And, on some of the debt funds that are out there that are really having trouble right now, I would say they were more leveraged debt vehicles, right? And that, when you leverage debt, you're a very highly leveraged instrument. And so it doesn't take much to cause the problems. This is why you're seeing what you're seeing right now. But in terms of opportunity, what I actually had to call my team with earlier today is what we've done well historically when we've been in these situations is to really position ourselves to not just deal with the crisis, but make sure we have a part of our team that's just dedicated thinking about where are the opportunities on the other side of that crisis and being positioned for those opportunities. And so, we've been taking the time, with the team of saying, okay, what's the world going to look like in the first 6 months, where there might be distress that we can come in and try to address that distress? What's the world going to look like when people think about how they work, live, and stay differently than they did before because of some things, Marianne, that you mentioned relative to like post 9/11. But in this case, it may be wellness related, concerns about densification, smart buildings that, not only are smart in terms of fresh air and things, but actually can notify tenants as to when there's changing environments or there's illness going around. So there's, logistics being an area where now people are relying more on same day delivery or next day delivery versus going to stores. So I think there's a lot that's going to be on the other side of this. We're early to determine what that's going to be, but clearly making sure that you don't get lost in the fog of war and not be thinking about what's on the other side. And what I have found historically is dedicating people just to that so that they don't get caught up in the minutia of having to deal through the crisis, and they have better clarity in doing that.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Long term, what do you think this means for office space in general? I mean, if people can work from home and there's still the productivity, is there less demand for office space? And conversely, if people have to work farther apart from one another, that's good for office space, construction long term. How do you think that will play out?
Ask both of you gentlemen, what has been what are you hearing from people about the experience of working from home? I personally believe that at the end of this, people will have a renewed appreciation of what to go to the office. Now, that may be a peculiarly New York centric thing, but I'm hearing something very different than like, wow, this really works for me.
I think people like it in doses, but yeah, maybe not.
Right.
For months.
And there may be, right. I think I agree with, there's going to be pros and cons. I mean, clearly, I think people are going to want to work differently. So you'll have less of, I think people are going to be concerned about the amount of densification that we've had before. I think people are going to pick up new tools like video teleconferencing, which I've been using around the clock, which I had never really used before, and say, you know what?
It all bought Zoom stock earlier than this.
It would have been great. But I also think that companies are also going to be thinking about having multiple locations more than they have had before. But redundancy, maybe even redundancy in the same region, which wasn't something they focused on as much as they have in the past. So I think there's going to be a lot of redefining, the way that the demands for office space, and there'll be some that will be a net positive, some that won't be. Some buildings will be better situated in terms of the physical nature and location than others. But it's going to be a moment in time where we're going to have to adjust and rethink it. And the same thing on densification, right? We've had this period, and I'm a big believer in the urbanization of America. And the question is, there's going to, how do we adapt urbanization, which is fully aligned to densification, in a manner that still it makes people comfortable in situations like this, right? It's not by accident that New York is really, the epicenter of the United States of this pandemic. It's because we are the most densified part of the United States, right? And so this is something that we have to address.
Okay. Go ahead, Marion.
I was just going to say that I do think that one of the things that emerges from this are just as you say, focus on things. I think air quality, which is something that curiously we've been talking about probably for 20 years, and with our newer building stock, and everybody just tunes it out. Now suddenly I think people are going to be very interested in, okay, tell us how you filter the air in this building. And it also goes to what part of the desirability of the newer product or the fully retrofitted product. Mm-hmm. I think those even simple things like our appreciation for green spaces. I think that if you ask people what they valued at this moment, part of it is being able to go out and walk into a park, some green space. And I think that we've always known that was special in New York. I think the emphasis on it, whether it's on the roof or whether it's on the ground, people really appreciate having that opportunity.
I think parties.
I'm sorry, just so that I also think there's going to be, like post 9/11, a rethinking of the pros and cons or of privacy, right? I mean, I think there's an element where post 9/11 everyone was concerned. Pre 9/11 everyone was concerned about privacy infringement, but then post 9/11 safety overwhelmed some of those elements of privacy. I think we're in a similar situation now that coming out of this virus, people are going to put a higher premium on wellness and knowing, sort of what's happening around them, and being willing to forego some privacy, probably opting into it to ensure that safety. And I mean, that's why places like Singapore and South Korea, have been more successful at stemming the pandemic more quickly and keeping it in check, because they have the ability to track where people are going. They can tell when people have temperatures. They're out using technology that makes them more informed, to the point where you could be in a crowd and it can tell you if someone has the virus or an illness and decide to walk away. So there's going to be things that I think come out of this that will, it's going to change what our social perception of what's important relative to our privacy versus our wellness.
Have you seen any real estate businesses pivot already, or that are taking advantage of the current reality? I mean, these events are an outgrowth of the new situation. We just did an office cocktail party on Zoom. Yoga classes, schools, everything else is going digital. Do you see anybody smart pivots in the real estate world that stick out?
I think everybody has gone to that. If there hasn't been, I didn't know till today that you could have up to 20,000 people on a Zoom call. That was, it's really been fascinating to watch how people completely learn the technology like that, because they want to be connected with one another. And I think that's all been great. Just going to some of the things that will be answered. I think we're going to have the great co-working answer at the end of this period as well. And by the way, I'm a believer that co-working is here to stay and that it really serves a function, but we're going to be able to figure out sort of the other elements of it too. And does in fact the physical environment work? To Scott's earlier point, do we want to be as dense? And which companies are strong enough in terms of, which are going to be solvent at the end of this period of time. And I think that's going to be part of the lessons that we learn here too.
Yeah. I also think that we're going to see real estate as a service, a trend that has been moving in a direction, accelerating this. I think people are going to expect more from their landlords and the building owners than they have before. They're going to have a sense of trust and a sense of, are you going to step up and make sure that I'm protected? Are you going to be there if there's issues? Are you going to provide more services? In our multifamily buildings, we have what's called an RXO, which is a residential experience officer. And we began to roll it out in some of our buildings, which is a person connected to an app that you can chat with. And if you need anything, like your dog walked or whatever that might be, you chat with your RXO, and your RXO would do that for you, or have your dry cleaning brought in, or have your food delivered. That's something. While we were piloting in one of our projects, we began to roll out a virtual RXO through our entire multifamily portfolio, so that anyone who feels sick, or anyone who's in self-isolation, or anyone that has been confirmed to have the virus, needs something, they can chat with the RXO. So they need medicine, they need food delivered. We'll leave it at their door if they need medical care. So that connectivity has all of a sudden become extremely important in the context of where we are right now. And I think a lot of those types of things are going to continue to evolve out of this because of the expectations that our customers are going to want.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Can I ask, Stuart, I just want to ask Scott, one of the things that has been somewhat shocking to me, or maybe more than somewhat, has been the way REITs have been hammered in the market. They always trade at some discount to their net asset value, but I feel as though, Scott, do you think that this is going to make people question whether the public markets are the right environment for real estate? Because I feel like it's been so disproportionate to what actually has occurred.
Yeah, so it's a good point, and I've also noticed it and have been watching carefully, and it's been interesting. My view has really been for quite some time that the real estate, which is a longer term business that needs to ride through cycles, needs to ride through challenges like this, really has not been appropriate to be in the public markets where it's a quarter by quarter business. And I think most of it was one of the drivers of us selling our business in 2007, was that combined with the restrictive nature of the public markets, right? Think about, where they are now. The business is changing, right? Everything we just talked about is the post, what I call C-19 world, is going to be very different than the pre-C-19 world. And the public markets do not really provide management teams with the flexibility to quickly adjust to those changes. And it's one of the reasons that we didn't want to be a public company, was because we saw so many of our customers needed more and more flexibility, and yet the public markets were getting more and more restrictive over time. And so if now it makes sense to shift your strategy and go into telehealth as an example, right? Or to do real estate as a service, it's harder to do that in the public markets. It's even more difficult when your stock price is so low that there's a question as to why would you buy anything, do anything, versus buy back your own stock if you believe that it's undervalued. So here's a window of time where there may be distress, there may be opportunity in the marketplace, and it's going to be very challenging for the public companies to do this. So it may, Marianne, to your point, it may accelerate whatever I think many people have been talking about it's going to happen for some time. It may accelerate the privatization of more and more of these public companies.
That's so much the way I look at it now, because again, I look at companies like Vornado or Brookfield, SL Green, all of them, and ask myself, how is this possible?
Correct.
I also find this issue of the hostility between politicians and our own industry, which probably has been at its highest level before all of this began. And I ask myself, is a new understanding of the value of real estate, and I don't just necessarily mean physical real estate, but what it brings to the larger community, whether it's the employment side, all of it, going to change things. This morning I got a call about the Building Congress putting together a group that's going to be thinking about recommendations that they're going to make. Things like, can we accelerate the ULURP process? I mean, things that have become so intractable that we've done everything that tamps down development. And I'm hoping that the new kind of rapprochement or understanding that exists is going to actually lead to, first of all, getting rid of nonsense. My favorite nonsense, charging landlords fines for empty retail space. I keep always asking myself, what landlord do I know who likes to keep their space empty, except for Sheldon Solo at 9 West? In the history of real estate, people want to collect rent. There's a reason why they're not collecting rent, and a fine is not going to make them give the space away. So I think that there has been a lot of nonsense talk about real estate. I'm hoping that this will maybe rebalance a little bit. I don't know if it will.
Yeah, I'm just not to get your hopes up, but there's been a big push in the heat of all this moment by labor and some of the elected officials to push the prevailing wage bill in Albany. So, in a moment of time where we're in crisis, economic, dark clouds are on the horizon. They're trying to sort of push through a situation for any project that gets $3 or $5 million of public funding to have to pay prevailing wage, which again, for those who don't know, prevailing wage isn't, it isn't just a living wage, right? It's prevailing wage or union wage rates, which have all the benefits and all the rules and regulations that make projects uneconomical to develop. And so it's going to be, if it goes through, it'd be, obviously a big thorn in the coming out of the cycle.
Seems like there could also be movement in Albany on obviously, eviction, prolonging that, and rent moratoriums and that sort of thing that could tie in politically. But it does seem like it's the time for the real estate industry to really, burnish its image after being politically unpopular over the past year or so. I mean, as past chairwoman of REBNY, Marianne, is there anything you think REBNY should be doing, to make sure they get the public on its side at this point?
I think the real estate board has been doing a number of things. First of all, they have been really sourcing a number of these locations for medical facilities and been very active doing it. They've also been making recommendations that have to do with making life easier for people not only in the profession but outside the profession, in terms of recommendations about eviction, about holdover, all manner of things that will make it easier for people to remain in place. Mm-hmm. And there's no question that they've been deeply philanthropic. I think we all read about Scott's contribution to New Rochelle, for example. This is something you're seeing across the board in our industry. I'm hoping that some of these things will resonate with people. I also think just on the plain employment side, I see that 32BJ employees and how owners have stood behind this employment base, whatever it is, 28,000 people who are involved with maintaining the buildings of the city, and realizing that this is the right way to handle things. And I think that has been the guiding principle of the board. So I'm hoping that there will be some recognition that the industry, just like I might point out in each crisis we've lived through, has always been the true bedrock. Again, would be somebody noticed.
Yeah, and I would just want to reiterate the point just on REBNY in particular, because I know REBNY's been under a lot of heat over the last year. When you're in a crisis like this is where you appreciate an industry group like REBNY. There's no way we as owners and participants in this industry could have made it through it or can make it through it without the guidance of REBNY. I mean, everyone, I know my team is relying on it every day to hear their take on what is the best practice, what's the interpretation of that order. And it's been, absolutely a necessity. So it's, we're blessed to have them. And I think also to Marianne's point about the industry and labor, I think all realizing that we got to work through this together, not making short-term decisions. I mean, you listen and maybe there's no choice, but you listen to the amount of companies that have so quickly furloughed or laid off, millions and millions of employees. The real estate industry is holding through. I mean, we have, closing construction projects because there's someone infected. We're not, people are going home. We're still paying them. We're paying millions of dollars a week
exactly the same thing. Yeah. Everything is basically shut down, but salaries are still being covered.
Right. And then I think that's what we're doing as an industry right now.
Another part of the political piece, I know Mayor de Blasio isn't necessarily a cheerleader for the industry, but I'm curious about, Governor Cuomo, and you have a close relationship, Scott. How do you think he thinks of the real estate industry as a time like this, and where does it fit into his overall approach?
Well, first, I would say that I think we're incredibly fortunate to have Governor Cuomo as our leader right now in the state, and I think he's really proven to be a model for the whole country. He has always thrived on having to work through crises from his time back at HUD, and he's done I watched him close up during Superstorm Sandy, and he knows how to do it. But what's to me, and watching him, I think it's just that he tells it as it is. He's compassionate. He's clear about what he's looking at, where he's trying to go, and he's enlisting as many people as he can enlist to help deal with the battle at hand. And so I don't think he's ever had an issue with the real estate industry. I think he's been a pragmatist and trying to find the right political balance on some of the issues that are out there. As governor, he's got certain powers that he can dictate and certain powers that he's got to build a consensus between the legislature which was moving, to Marion's point, further left at that point. But I think his, even yesterday, again, bringing in all his old secretaries to the governor to come as part of his, again, with Stephen Cohn and Larry Schwartz and Bill Morrow. These are very capable people that know how the systems work. This isn't the first time they've made it through a crisis, and so it's going to be. I think he's the exact type person that that we'd want in this role at this time, and he's doing, I think, in my opinion, everything right, up to date.
Can I say that I second everything that Scott has just said? And by the way, when I heard about Bill Morrow and Steve Cohen, et cetera, I thought to myself, just right to head the economic recovery and already to be focused on that. It's just exactly what he should be doing. But wouldn't this be wonderful if this is a moment where, as a result of what's happened, when we select people for office, we actually care about what they're capable of the job, whether they have the experience that's needed, the judgment, the management skills, et cetera. And it's not about a lot of sound bites or tweets. And it's watching somebody who has spent the better part of his life in government and understands what all the levers are that need to be pushed. I even think, for example, on the construction side, a lesser person would have just said, shut it all down. He looked in a nuanced way at what was happening in construction, realizing, let's not stop certain things. Let's not lose these jobs. Let's look at it sort of location by location and make those decisions. So it's not that he's just making the big broad statements. He's actually really digging down deep and getting the right people in the right places. Mm-hmm. And that's, I think next time we select a mayor, or for that matter, a president, it would be nice to look at the resume and understand that they know what to do.
We have a question from our readers. If any of you have ever considered running for mayor?
I actually have said to Scott, I would like to work on his campaign for governor.
It's a tough job. I gotta run for RXR right now.
All right. You were talking about construction. Should there be essential construction and non-essential construction, or how are you kind of handling construction on your projects that are going on now, Scott?
Yeah, so we've actually instituted, again, at the guidance of REBNY, protocols in the field where, we take the teams, we rotate people on and off site. So we boom, my teams come onto our sites, they get their temperature taken when they come on the site, mm-hmm. To see if anyone has a temperature, and then we practice social distancing when they're working. Most of the work we're trying to do is outside work, exterior work. But to the extent that someone ends up, being tested positive, we're closing down for a week, and then seeing if anyone else gets a fever or develops any other symptoms, and then we'll restart back up again. But it's very tough to shut down the whole economy, right? And construction in particular. When you come out this other side, if projects just stop, it's very hard to get them going again. And so, whether that's the big infrastructure projects that we have, or the general construction projects that are happening here in the city around the New York area, I think it's something that keep going. It's the best to do. You got to be cautious. And this whole thing is tough, right? I mean, you're all torn, but you're torn as there's a part of you that says, okay, we got to go back to work. And this is what I think the governor looked at, right? So he puts date out of April 19th. It's a date where he's going to look to say what's happening. And what are the things he's going to look at? He's going to look at, what is the rate we are in terms of hospitalizations? Have we peaked yet? Are we coming down? Has the surge happened? What's in that pipeline? What type of the different types of tests that we have? Can we now test everyone? So just not testing people that have symptoms, but to test everyone to see if they have the virus or not. There's talk about trying to find a test to see if someone had the virus, and if they had the virus, if they would then be contagious or not. If we can figure out that people had the virus and are no longer contagious, we can then, start having them back into the workforce. And so I think there's all these different elements. And as the next few weeks roll on, they're all going to, start playing out simultaneously, which will, by the time we get towards the end of April, I think we'll have better clarity. It doesn't mean that end of April we're going to get back to normal. Maybe some people will be able to get back to normal. Maybe it's that we feel like we're another month away. But you got to look at all those different elements there.
Mm-hmm. I want to take a couple of questions from our viewers right now for the last few minutes we have. In terms of the multifamily market, obviously hit hard by rent reform from a landlord point of view and, impacted by eviction moratorium. What do you see ahead for it? And also we had one question from the reader about, if people are not working as a multifamily landlord, what kind of do you ask them for proof that people aren't working, or how do you kind of deal with that, situation as far as people not paying rent?
Yeah, so I think again, our approach to all this thing is be compassionate, be sensitive to the current circumstance. I think fortunately, the team members in our buildings have close enough relationships with our residents that I think we would know whether or not they're fabricating, that they're not working, or what they're at in that situation, and so. We're going to see. I think April. We're not there yet. To Marianne's point before, a lot of this is conjecture, right? I mean, with this, 3 weeks ago, the world was humming, and as Marianne said, we started this year with record amount of leasing, record amount of activity, and then everything came to a halt. I think as we get into April, we're going to start seeing more and more of these different cases, and we're going to have to try to address them on a case by case basis. Obviously, we're not going to be taking aggressive action against anyone over this next period of time until we get some clarity on things. But the ones that have jobs that can pay need to pay. Otherwise, we run into that cascading event that we described earlier, which is the challenge.
Do you think April 1 will be a telling date from that point of view?
No, I think we're going to have to get much deeper into the month to know anything.
Right.
April 1 is next week.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And how about another question from a reader? If you took an average Manhattan apartment today or a Midtown skyscraper, where do you suspect prices have come down since the virus hit, or is that not even a question because no deals would be closed?
Actually, deals are being closed. And one of the things that Darcy Stakem, who heads our investment sales, would say, and I'm sure you'll ask them when you're interviewing them, Stuart, is that when repricings have happened at 9/11 or after 2008, they haven't been massive repricings. I think really one of the interesting things that's going to come of this as the market begins to find its way in terms of cap rates, et cetera, is where the opportunities present themselves, because there's no question that people who are highly leveraged, this is going to be in so many ways, in not just in the real estate realm, but in business in general, this is going to be a moment for liquidity. And those with liquidity are actually going to find this, again, presuming on all the human elements, good health for themselves and their loved ones, that this will be a moment of opportunity for those people.
I know Sam Zell has $3.4 billion sitting in cash. He's kind of known as the guy who steps up at moments like these.
Right, the grave dancer, they call him.
Exactly, right.
What was it? That's staying alive till
95. Staying alive tonight. Right. Was it 95 or 95, right? Or was it 2005? 95 must have been.
Doing this forever.
Yeah. And Marianne, you said deals are still closing, and they're closing virtually. How is that happening?
Yeah, they are closing virtually. I mean, it's been really interesting to watch sort of the different reactions, because there's a certain again, you have to think of the scale of the market. Okay, last year we did call it 40 million square feet of leasing in New York City. I'm talking about office leasing. So logically, there are people who are actually flourishing. We mentioned a few minutes ago about Peloton. I mean, there are other businesses that are housed here who are actually finding growth in this moment. And then there are people who are confident enough of their future solvency, their cash positions, et cetera, that they're moving ahead with what they want to do. On the other hand, I do have to say there's been a fair amount of sort of pressing the pause button. There's been less just walking away. And the pause button invariably is about whether or not they want to invest capital at this point, or whether they want to hold on to that capital to see what results. I think that the one thing I feel like we can say with some relative degree of certainty is that we'll see a spike in the number of renewals that will happen, either short-term or long-term, over the next year. That seems like the one thing that is consistent through all of these.
And these are renewals that because people just want to stay in place?
It's renewals because they want to get greater clarity on where their business is.
Right. All right. Well, I think we covered a lot of ground today. And I appreciate the high level take, guys. It's great to hear from both of you. And I want everyone out there to stay safe and practice social distancing. And I want to thank our sponsor, Churchill Real Estate. And don't forget to join us tomorrow at 5 p.m. And we've got the biggest brokers in LA in the residential market. Thursday, Michael Chavot. And Friday, we have the top iSales brokers in the city. So go to the top of our homepage for more. And thanks again, guys.
Thank you.
I appreciate it.
Be well. Be well, Scott.
Be well. Thanks, Aaron. You too. Bye.